Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. What a pleasure to see so many of you here back at the GCSP. It's been a while. Some of you have not had the chance to see for 2 years, so it's a really great pleasure. And welcome back. And I see all of you are healthy and in good spirits. Today, I have the wonderful opportunity to launch the first event of the GCSP Geneva Security Debates. The debates will consist of public discussions on current security challenges. Each month, we will unite the world's leading thinkers and practitioners in the field of security for interactive discussions. In the short run, we hope that these Geneva Security Debates will inform policymakers in Geneva and in the surrounding area on new insights, joint reflections, and networking. In the long run, we hope that these debates will help us to shape a more peaceful future. To kick off our first Geneva Security Debate, I have the honor to launch a book called The Art of Diplomacy, a book that was first started as a dedication to Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. It was to dedicate his long and distinguished career. While the book was meant to have only 75 contributions representing Professor Ischinger's 75 youthful years, their book instead had over 300 contributors, showing how many people Ambassador Ischinger has influenced and inspired. The book is a substantive work, and I highly recommend it. I read it, the entire book, and I have to tell you, from beginning to end, it does not disappoint. To help launch the debate and the book, we have today this illustrious panel. Professor Wolfgang Ischinger, German diplomat, president of the Foundation Council of the Munich Security Conference Foundation, and former ambassador to the United States, and former ambassador to the UK, and an associate fellow of the GCSP.
I wasn't aware of that.
Along with our panelists, we have Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Swiss diplomat and director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and former Secretary General of the OSCE. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Schori-Liang, and I work on terrorism and PV and organized crime here at the center. I'm also a visiting professor at Sciences Po at Paris. Today, we are going to discover the best kept secrets on the art of diplomacy. Is it a craft or something in between? With me to explore the art of diplomacy, you see before you two of the world's most experienced diplomats who will offer you not only their advice on what really matters when negotiating war and peace, but also their valued insights on how diplomacy will be an important tool in our diplomatic toolbox to fix our turbulent world. Ambassador Greminger, to start, can you tell us first how you met Professor Ischinger, and what are some of the ways that you have crossed paths and cooperated with one another over the years?
Thank you, Christina. At the outset, let me tell you, how proud I am to be with you on this stage. With I think it's fair to say, a giant of European diplomacy. I have known you for many years, and I would also admit that once I started engaging in security policy, you quickly became my role model. But no, this was, I was kind of watching you from very, very far. We started then interacting in 2014. Switzerland was chairing the OSCE. I was chairing the Permanent Council in Vienna. And we were devising approaches on how to prevent further escalation of what was then called the crisis in around Ukraine. And then quite early on, in the first few months, one of the ideas that we came up with was to launch an intra-Ukrainian dialogue. And I think that must have been in April 2014. And then, of course, immediately the question was on the table: who, would facilitate, mediate such an inter-Ukrainian dialogue? And since we had all along our chairmanship a very close relation between, let's say, the triangle Bern, Vienna, and Berlin, it was in a way an obvious choice to ask you, and you accepted. And indeed, I think over a time period of a month, 1.5 months, you facilitated a number of important dialogue events in Ukraine, and and I think a process that got traction. But I'd be keen to hear your assessment, particularly now with hindsight. My sense, as seen from Vienna, was the process had traction, and we had then also hopes that it would then basically be taken over by the Ukrainians themselves, and then to our major disappointment, once President Poroshenko got elected president in May 2014. We then kind of waited for the resumption of the dialogue. We waited and waited and waited, and the dialogue, unfortunately, was never resumed. That was our first, still relatively distant encounter. The second, more closer encounter was when we Swiss kind of, relatively self-confident by more or less successfully preventing further escalation of the crisis in around Ukraine, thought that, okay, now we should also tackle the fundamental issues of European security, and instead of, simply manage conflict. And, we raised a number of issues, to then discover that there was absolutely no appetite on track one among governments to discuss these issues. Well, the argument, of course, was, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, this ongoing destabilization process in parts of Ukraine, it's just not possible to discuss fundamental issues of European security on a governmental level. Well, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative was then to ask a panel of eminent persons to launch a process of reflection and come up with recommendations. And to tell you the truth, the idea then was, of course, you would start your reflection. Ambassador Ischinger led that panel of eminent persons. And you would then conclude and present your conclusions at the point when the crisis in around Ukraine was resolved, right? And so we would then bring your recommendations exactly in a moment when track one actors would be ready to discuss these issues. Well, as we know, this did not happen like that. At the same time, I would still argue what you produced under challenging circumstances is an extremely insightful report, and I would, recommend you reading it. The core of the report is basically three different narratives on, how Europe got into the mess we felt we were in 2014. Not surprisingly, a Western narrative and an Eastern narrative, but I think what was also quite particular, there was also the narrative of these so-called in-between states and these bridge states. And by the way, as we speak, there is right now a track 2 process ongoing, facilitated by the GCSP with these bridge state representatives. So yeah, that's I think how we met. I know I should stop here. Of course, we then also interacted quite closely when I participated at the Munich Security Conference, in particular when I was Secretary General of the OSCE, and I was also grateful that more than once, you provided me with nice platforms, nice panels, and of course, as an SG, I did appreciate that very much.
And one other thing, Ambassador contributed to the book as well, so that's also important. Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass the floor to Professor Ischinger. What has led you to come to us today, and looking forward to hear your thoughts about the GCSP.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Christina, for hosting us here today. It's a privilege for me and a real pleasure to be together again with Ambassador Greminger. He's already explained what brought us together a decade ago or so. But let me, before I try to respond to some of these substantive issues, let me say a word about the book. One of the two responsible editors of this book is, of course, sitting here, Benedikt Franke. His name is on the cover, Tobias Bunde and Benedikt Franke. And I want to share with you here a little unknown secret, namely, what made the Munich security team, led by Benedikt and his colleague Tobias, to act behind my back, because I had no idea what they were doing, to ask dozens and dozens and dozens of prominent international political types to provide contributions to this volume, which then was developed. Well, you see, what had happened after I had taken over the Munich Security Conference leadership in 2008, at some point, and I would say that must have been like 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, the team was beginning to ask itself, when is this guy finally going to retire? And when there was not much of a sign of my willingness to retire, they decided to come up with this book to make it not easier, but to practically force me to say, okay, thank you very much. This is now what in German academic circles they call a Festschrift. And the Festschrift is usually something which is given to a professor who is finally, going into full-time retirement, etc. So again, Benedikt, for making it easier, and you really made it easier for me to think about succession, which is extremely important. When I look back at this period of, from 2008 to today, I can honestly say I would have had no problem continuing for another few years. But I do understand, and I'm glad that I was able to understand, that there is really a need to hand these kinds of responsibilities to the next generation, and to try to organize frictionless succession. And I'm very proud at this moment, in this late spring or early summer of 2022, that we've managed, after such a long time of 14 years, a succession process where a successor, who is now, with the help of Benedikt and his team, running the operational responsibilities, taking over the operational responsibilities of the Munich Security Conference, and giving me a chance to step back and take a more strategic look, not an everyday responsibility look at things. And I really believe that this book, to which I was at the end of the process invited to provide also a small contribution, but by that time all the authors had already been selected, etc., etc. So I can not claim any responsibility for anything that's in the book, but I can join you and others in recommending to you, if you're interested in this treasure of diplomatic wisdom, going through this book with very, very different views and contributions on very different aspects of diplomacy. While I have the floor, let me just make one important point. We are in June of 2022. As we speak, today, on this day, Emmanuel Macron, Prime Minister Draghi, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz are actually in Kiev right now. I assume they must have already they must have already concluded their session with President Zelensky. And this, of course, raises the question, and there will be dozens of op-eds in English, in French, in Italian, in German, and other languages, days and weeks, as there have been many such op-eds in the recent past. What about diplomacy? How do you go from war, which is where we are, to peace, or at least to the absence of war, meaning a truce or a ceasefire or some kind of an end of hostilities? And I want just to use this opportunity to express one wisdom, one conclusion that I've been able to draw from my own involvement in my diplomatic career in these types of exercises. I mean, you mentioned of course, the Ukraine experience. In the 1990s and beyond, I was very deeply involved in our collective attempt to end the hostilities in the Balkans. And I've learned the hard way that if you're interested in creating a process where two powers, two countries, two armies, two nations that are fighting against each other militarily, if you're interested in getting them to sit down at a table and negotiate seriously about how to end the war and how to create a peaceful arrangement, there is one important precondition for the art of diplomacy to be developed, to be used in such a circumstance. And that is a very, very simple precondition. Both parties, in the current case, the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian government, both sides need to come to the conclusion that on the battlefield, they are not likely to make much more progress. In other words, Mr. President Putin needs to come to a conclusion. He needs to be told by his generals, even if we try, maybe we can make another couple of kilometers, but at what expense in terms of men and material and ammunition and cost? So maybe it's not going to get much better. Maybe we should now offer to talk. And of course, the same precondition would need to exist on the Ukrainian side. That is then, and only then, the moment where diplomacy can begin to blossom, and where you can develop such a scenario as we developed it in '95 with a negotiating setting in the American Air Force base at Dayton, Ohio. I hope we don't need to go to Dayton, Ohio in order to conclude the Ukrainian war. But what I do believe is that it is wrong, and I really wanted to say this here with so many experts on these issues in the room. I believe it is really entirely wrong when people argue that Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz or whoever else should not talk to Putin because this is the wrong approach. I believe that if we want to take diplomacy seriously, We need to engage and to talk, even if we are convinced that the guy we're talking to is a war criminal. We could not have concluded the Dayton Peace Accord if we had determined that President Milosevic, because he is a war crimes perpetrator, we're not going to talk to him, and we don't want him to sign our paper. We asked him to sign our paper, and that was why peace was finally brought about in the Balkan situation. So I think I would want to defend those who try to conduct, even under rather desperate circumstances, at least a little bit of a search for contact, for discussion, using hopefully opportunities to remind the other side that it's not only about winning a war, it's also about your own respectability and about your own future security, etc., etc. So the art of diplomacy is not only an art, it's a craft. It is complicated. It needs education. Thank you for providing, through this institution, substantial education and training. It is not an easy art, but it requires, if we want it to blossom, it requires certain preconditions. And these preconditions, unfortunately, do not exist on the 16th of June between Kiev and Moscow, I'm afraid to say. So let's work for it, and let's not give up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. I'm going to start off with 3 sections. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the art of diplomacy. Then we're going to talk about current events, because I know all of you are very keen to hear both of our gentlemen here perspective on what's happening. And then we're going to talk about the future of diplomacy. So this is sort of the menu for today. So first of all, I would like to start with Ambassador Greminger. James Stavridis wrote in The Art of Diplomacy that true security does not solely come from the barrel of a gun. You need to balance between hard and soft power if you are to find real security. Diplomats and the military need to work together to build lasting security. What are the best steps to begin this process?
This reminds me of a NATO doctrine of 1967, the Harmal Doctrine. And the Harmal Doctrine, I think that's still a very valid concept. It basically argues a sound security policy is built on 2 pillars. It's built on deterrence, but you also need this other pillar, détente, that is dialogue. And I think that is still true. But obviously, depending on the situation, you need more of one component than of the other. But I think it's important that we always try to work and focus on both. And in that sense, I agree. Even though right now, we will all agree that deterrence is by far the dominant approach to security policy, will probably remain so for the foreseeable future. But still, I think we shouldn't miss on opportunities to dialogue, to engage. And in that sense, I very much support, your call. I think it's kind of fashionable to criticize all those, that still try to talk to President Putin. But I think it's important to kind of exploit the smallest window for advancing it. At the same time, I also share your assessment that unfortunately the sides right now they want to win the battle for the Donbass, and they're not yet ready to return to the negotiation table. I mean, what you described, William Sartman, the big conflict researcher, once said, parties are ready to seriously engage in a process to resolve a conflict once they perceive a mutually hurting stalemate, right? And I think we are not there yet, unfortunately, and so for the time being, there is little scope for diplomacy, and I think it's the military means that dominate for the weeks to come, perhaps for the months to come. I hope, of course, not for a determined period. Perhaps where diplomacy, would still have to come in particular if this war drags on, and I think that's unfortunately not an unrealistic scenario, is like in an approach of compartmentalizing relations. There are important issues that would still need to be talked about, addressed, despite of this war. And simply for those that have been observing a bit the strategic stability dialogue between the United States and the Russian Federation, talking about nuclear arms, hypersonic, non-proliferation, space, new technologies. I think these are issues that need to be discussed, because and I think there is also an interest by major powers to continue discussing these issues. You have regional issues, Syria, Iran, etc., that you want to tackle. So I think that is where I still would see a space for diplomacy, also in the short run.
Thank you so much. Professor Ischinger, you've always had a knack at balancing between the military and between diplomats. You have found sort of a perfect way to bridge the divide. Could you share with us your insights?
I don't remember which British Prime Minister said what I'm now going to quote, but I do remember that it was one of the 19th century British Prime Ministers. And he said something to the effect, diplomacy is so much more fun if it's backed up by a couple of effective regiments. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, and we need to take it seriously. If you turn the sentence around, you could argue, and I think this is also a valid point that one can make, that diplomacy without any power of enforcement or any opportunity of enforcement actually risks to be merely the exchange of rhetoric, and will rarely lead to sustainable longer-term solutions. So I think we need to, or we should conclude that diplomacy should have primacy. But crisis diplomacy, when it is about war and peace and about conflict and conflict prevention and conflict resolution, then it does help if your diplomatic effort can be backed up either nationally or internationally, collectively, by a potential of enforcement. And as a young idealist diplomat, the world that I wanted to believe in when I first joined the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations in 1973, that was a world where I thought the UN would, in such cases, deploy under a mandate of the UN Security Council, in other words, an internationally legitimate collective effort to end a war, whether this is in the Congo or in Asia or anywhere else. Unfortunately, the international system has not been developed in this direction, and the enforcement capacity of the UN never took shape. And the enforcement capacity of our European institutions, of course, is also lacking. As you know better than anyone else, as a former leader of OSCE. So we need both. We need effective diplomacy, and we need to take diplomacy seriously. And taking diplomacy seriously means to leave no stone unturned. It means that you don't want to give up, even if in the first or second or third attempt you're not going to make much progress. Diplomacy is sometimes synonymous to, strategic patience. Sometimes, and I could quote examples of that from my own career experience, sometimes diplomacy will lead to a success because you choose a better moment. Sometimes a solution is not possible in June of 2022, but maybe it will be possible in September of 2022, or maybe in September of 2023. So der lange Atem, as we say in German, the strategic patience is sometimes important, and the timing and the determination are important. We should never give up. But if we can back it up by a certain capacity of enforcement, by a certain capacity of being taken seriously, a certain military capacity, then diplomacy is likely to be more successful than without such a backup.
Thank you so much. And for those non-German speakers, lange Atem is a long breath, taking a big, deep breath. So our leaders today are using, thank you so much for that excellent response, both of you. Our leaders today are using Twitter to directly communicate with their polity and with foreign leaders, cajoling, instructing, and sometimes even threatening. But for almost every country in the world, the person who knows a specific government the most is the country's ambassador there. So what can we do to make our leaders understand the importance of bringing diplomats back to the negotiating table? Who would like to begin?
Well, I guess we have to show them that there is something in it for them. Politicians, I think they want to have successes that can be shown to their constituencies, and I think if as a diplomat you have an agenda, I think it's a matter of marketing it to the diplomats, and often my experience with some of my bosses was, I had lots of freedom of maneuver, but I needed to provide one or two items, that were useful for a minister, to show to his constituency that she is serious and successful in foreign policy. I think as a Secretary General of the OSCE, for me, one of the key challenges was, to explain to ministers of foreign affairs, ministers of defense, what is in it for them, by engaging with the OSCE, and that was not an easy sell. And then, of course, you could argue managing a conflict, defending principles and commitments, but this is all relatively abstract multilateral language that works well with diplomats. But once you talk to a politician, I think you just have to change, your narrative, your arguments, and so I think it's what is in it for a politician That is absolutely key. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Please, Professor Ischinger, how can we get our government leaders to stop tweeting and actually talking to the experts who really know something?
Well, let me add to what Thomas has just said. Let me add that we often talk of the diplomatic toolbox. What are the tools in the diplomatic toolbox? Well, there are a number of tools. We just mentioned, for example, military backup. It's also part of the toolbox. But of course, the principal tool that's in the diplomatic toolbox is the diplomat. Is diplomatic expertise, is the presence of diplomats in international institutions, in bilateral diplomatic relations, etc. And just by way of example, I mean, since I brought a copy of it, since you mentioned the 2015 eminent persons effort, well, that was a complex task, as you said, with a Western narrative and a Russian narrative and a narrative of the countries in between. But this exercise, mandated by the OSCE leadership, of course, offered an opportunity to leaders, like in this case, in my case, the German foreign minister, when he was asked, so what the hell are you doing now that the European security architecture seems to have fallen apart because the Russians have grabbed Crimea, and isn't that a total disaster for the existing rules-based, at least European rules-based international order, and OSCE cannot do much more than launch and deploy the special monitoring mission, etc. Well, the fact that this group was created gave to our political leaders, those who need to respond to parliamentary and to media questions, gave them the good excuse to say, well, I've just actively participated in mandating this group, which is tasked to come up with suggestions. And then we will see to what extent we can implement these suggestions. That's one part of my answer. The other part of my answer would be this. If you have diplomatic tools, why don't we use them? And I don't want to generalize this, but I can say that as far as the German practice of the last 20, 25 years is concerned, I've been very unhappy, not so much during my ambassadorial tours, but when I was responsible for the foreign ministry as Staatssekretär, as the British would say, as permanent undersecretary, I received daily complaints from my ambassadorial colleagues around the world. They called and said, well, tomorrow the chancellor is coming to my country, and I've just been told that I'm going to be excluded from the meeting because the chancellor wants to be only surrounded by his or her 2 or 3 close advisors and etc. So I think that is totally bad practice, and that is misuse or non-use of the diplomatic toolbox. We don't want to claim that our ambassadors, wherever they serve, are smarter and know more than the diplomatic advisors. I'm not trying to say that. But what I want to say is that if you send the right kind of ambassador to a certain country, you can expect that particular person, if he has served in that place for more than a couple of months, you can expect him or her to be better equipped to read between the lines of what the host government is either saying or trying not to say, or only trying to say between the lines. And that is why I think it is bad practice for leaders, whether they are prime ministers or heads of state or chancellors, to ignore their own diplomatic toolbox. Why the hell do we appoint ambassadors if we don't use them and their staff? It's not only the ambassadors personally, it's also the capacity of their staff. So let's use it.
Thank you so much.
If I may, in the same vein, you know, of using diplomatic tools that are available, I mean, what I've been observing with quite some concern over the last decade or so is, you know, this tendency to understand diplomacy more exclusively as public diplomacy, you know. So, and you know, kind of also misusing platforms created for silent diplomacy, real diplomacy, for public diplomacy purposes, and particularly, you know, having worked so many years in an OSCE setting, the Permanent Council, you know, created as a platform where on a weekly basis 57 ambassadors could come together, you know, and conduct a meaningful dialogue on issues relevant for European security, be it, you know, short-term crisis management, but also addressing long-term issues. This platform has turned in an exclusive body of public diplomacy, and that's a pity. And you know, and I also see the profile of younger ambassadors more and more turning into public relation experts, and less, you know, this intrinsic commitment to explore common space, try to figure out, you know, even though, you know, we are in deep trouble and we disagree on so many things, but what, you know, could perhaps, you know, bring us together, where, you know, is there a common space? Is there some sort of a win-win, you know, that could allow us to reconstruct just a little of trust and confidence. You know, this mindset I find more and more missing, and that would also be something, you know, that I think here we need. That's also in a way a different call of back to diplomacy, right?
Thank you so much.
Can I?
Absolutely.
Can I just add a footnote to this and support this point? When you think about the current stalemate in the Ukraine war, I would strongly suggest that the expectation that some meaningful diplomatic outcome will come out of public declarations made either by our leaders or by the Russian Federation or by President Zelensky and his staff, the expectation that will lead to something is minimal. That's, as you said, the public style of diplomacy. Why don't we go back more often and with greater determination to what we call quiet diplomacy? You know, when we were talking about Entspannungspolitik in the era of the Cold War, when the two German states were trying to figure out a way to coexist and to work together in the 1970s, when Henry Kissinger, mandated by Richard Nixon, was trying to open a way to to develop a relationship between the United States and China, none of this would have happened if it had been conducted as part of a public diplomacy. Nixon flew to China, if I recall correctly, 4 or 5 times, secretly. Secretly. When I lived in Washington, my neighbor, a retired Army colonel, U.S. Army colonel, Air Force colonel, was actually the guy who flew Nixon each time to China in a kind of a CIA plane or something like that. And so I got the whole story, secret flights that not even the senators knew about in Washington, D.C. And Egon Bahr, the German negotiator with the Soviet Union, with the GDR, of course, conducted for many, many months totally quiet diplomatic effort not a secret diplomatic effort, but a quiet diplomatic effort, an effort that was kept from public discussion until such a moment when a result was ready to be presented. And I think what is really part of the art of diplomacy is to find the right mix between, of course, the need to have as much public diplomacy as we can present, but we need also as much quiet and sometimes even secret diplomacy as we need in order to get something started which, if in the public limelight, would never work.
Thank you so much. And I deeply appreciated your comments on that Ostpolitik and all ping pong politics, I think it was called. I really also really liked what you wrote in the book, your insights on how to use the diplomatic toolbox, and especially your recent example of the 2008 NATO communique. I thought it was really revealing. Would you like to speak to that?
Okay, well, I know we need to be brief.
Or they still need to buy the book.
We need to be brief. But the point I'm trying to make with reference to the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest is it's a very simple point. If you use the diplomatic toolbox correctly, if you are the head of state or the head of government, you don't want to do the negotiating yourself. You want to delegate it. Why do you want to delegate it? Not necessarily because you know that your ambassador or your senior official is better equipped than you are, but for a very different and very simple reason. If you ask the NATO Council, the ambassadors, to negotiate a text, a draft text for the summit, and then when this draft text is presented to you, then you as a head of state or foreign minister or head of government, you always have recourse, you have the option of saying, that's not good enough. You guys go back to the drawing board, I want you to do another session, come back with a better formula. The problem with doing the negotiating yourself is that it's like in a court system, there is no upper court. There is no court to which this can be, sent for review and improvement. Once, the Merkels and the Clintons and the Macrons of this world have personally agreed a text, that's the end of the story. And you can't improve it. You will not improve it because they will lose face. If somebody says it's not good enough, go back. So that is why I think it is part of good diplomacy to try to delegate such drafting exercises to those who are supposed to do the drafting exercise, and then only to take it up by those who finally, approve it when it's agreed, when it's essentially agreed. What happened in 2008 is that the NATO ambassadors were unable to find agreed language on this famous question of offering a NATO perspective for Georgia and Ukraine. It's a very current question. And what happened in Bucharest was that because the NATO ambassadors had been unable to agree a formula, at the end of the day, the Sarkozys, the Merkels, the Obamas needed to sit down themselves. And I was not in the room, but I was told that President Bush, it was not Obama, of course, it was Bush, George W. Bush, at one point apparently said, but I've already promised this to the Georgians and to the Ukrainians. So in order to allow George W. Bush to save face, his colleagues, including the German Chancellor and everybody else, agreed a sentence which they thought was harmless. A sentence which read more or less like, Ukraine and Georgia will be members of the North Atlantic Alliance, with no date attached to it. So they thought, that's okay. No one will get excited about this. Well, I can tell you, and many of you will know this, that in Moscow, this was interpreted as an act of war, as a declaration of war. It was exactly interpreted as what the Russians were fearing most at that time, namely that this perspective was going to be offered. And because our heads of state personally had agreed the text, there was no one around who was able to say, look, this is a very bad idea. Can we go back, review this text, and maybe come up with a slightly different formula, because this is going to create all sorts of mischief in Moscow. So let's delegate drafting exercises to those who are supposed to do the drafting exercises, and let our heads of state, these collective sessions, whether it's in the EU or whether it's at NATO or in other fora, let them prove a text, but let's try to prevent them from negotiating and drafting it themselves.
Thank you so much. To ask a difficult question. Apologies in advance. The US and Europe are by bolstering Ukraine are hoping to send a strong message to China that the NATO alliance is strong and it is shoring up its own power, especially with the NATO summit coming up. Do you, Ambassador Greminger, believe China can still be deterred, given its increasing military power and its competing vision of global order?
Yeah, it's a challenging question, but I would still, I would argue that this US-European unity now, this joint resolve, this very clear positioning now against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think this delivers a very strong political message, and I'm pretty sure that this must impress the Chinese leadership, and I think also this sanction package, that was adopted. I think it's the most comprehensive sanction package ever adopted. Is impacting. I'm not saying that it is changing Russian policies, but I mean it having a huge impact. And particularly also, and this is important from a Chinese perspective, it has a huge impact on global economy. And if China pursues one strategic objective, then it is to maintain high economic growth rates. And so I think there, now witnessing, how negatively this impacts the global economy, I think that again is another strong signal. And then, perhaps also from a more military perspective, what I think we have learned so far, and what is a major power with military ambitions would have to learn. You need, a tremendous military superiority if you want to be successful, and I think that's another perhaps a lesson that they're probably learning. So I think at least for the short to medium term, I'm relatively confident that this has a mitigating impact on potential imperial ambitions of China.
Thank you. Professor Ischinger, are you on the same line? Do you agree?
Well, let me try a slightly different approach, because I totally agree with what Thomas Greminger has said. But let me add this. Sanctions, agreeing sanctions packages has become an extremely popular activity, and I want to offer 2 points on that. I do not I would not argue that sanctions make no sense. On the contrary, I think sometimes they are important. We've had cases, and you're all aware of these cases, where our governments knew that about this particular issue, they were not going to go to war, but they also could not do nothing and simply ignore some illicit behavior by certain states, including Russian behavior in the current crisis. So yeah, sanctions, that's what you do if you have no better idea. But there's of course a problem with sanctions, and we're actually seeing it manifest itself even as we speak in the Russian debate about the current sanctions. Such sanctions have the unfortunate effect of creating in the country that is targeted by the sanctions what we call in German the Wagenburg effect. It allows the leader, in this case President Putin, to say, from now on, you know, there's in Russia no opposition and no party A, B, C, and D. They're only Russians because we're being attacked by some foreign powers, and therefore, if you want to be a decent, loyal citizen of Russia, please support me because I'm your leader and I'm being attacked by some foreign powers. That's what you call the Wagenburg effect, and that is, of course, very unfortunate. That does not mean that we should not apply sanctions, but I think what we don't do often enough in trying to use our diplomatic toolbox is to think about the exact opposite of sanctions, which is incentives. Can we think of something which we could offer to a certain country in order to prevent it from misbehaving? Hanging a little sausage, you know, as you would for your dog, to train your dog to do this and not to do that. Can we hang a little sausage and make it attractive for a particular leader or a particular country to do something or not to do something else? So I think that it's always important that we ask ourselves this very simple question. In this particular case, is it necessary to go into the sanctions business, or is it possible to start our activity by offering maybe an incentive? And if the incentive approach doesn't work, we can still always go back to the sanctions approach, right? That's what I wanted to mention.
Thank you so much. Russian leaders have watched with mounting resentment as the transatlantic alliance has nearly doubled its membership since the end of the Cold War. President Vladimir Putin has drawn a red line in Ukraine. Managing relations with Russia will be an immense policy challenge, no matter how or soon the war ends. There is no easy path back to a cooperative relationship, not even a narrow transactional one. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov admits as much. He recently said that Russia was at an historic turning point, like 1917 or 1991. For a senior Russian official, there is no more dire way to describe the moment than to compare it to these two cases of regime collapse. What are your thoughts about this?
Can I perhaps, before I come to this really, really tough one, just a word also on sanctions. And I totally agree. You know, sanctions, it's often because there are no alternatives. But somehow you need to punish, and then you. But of course, this does not what we, eventually would expect from sanctions. That it doesn't trigger policy change. And here, I would say also, in the logic of offering a sausage or a carrot, we should also much more systematically think about sanction relief as an incentive. And I think this has been, for instance, a mistake in the sanction regime since 2014. There were attempts at some point in time to kind of, start defining what Russian policy changes would have to happen in order to provide some sanction relief. But this was a discussion that was not really then pulled through. And so, and basically, if you talk today to Russians about sanctions, their assessment is simple. Sanctions come, but they never go. So, and I think it would be important to also reflect what would have to change in Russian behavior in order to offer sanction relief as an incentive, as a positive, so that on sanctions. Now, on basically the question, I mean, if I understand you right, Christina, you're asking, what is there a way of bringing Russia back to a European security order? Well, I think in the short term, that's difficult, if not impossible to imagine, and particularly also with the current government. And this is why I said before, we will mainly see a dominance of deterrence policies. We'll see attempts to isolate. We will see many features that remind those of us that have still, witnessed a Cold War, will remind us of some sort of a new Cold War. I think that's what we are about to see, even if there is an end to the hot war. At some point, in the medium to long term, I hope there will be, attempts to return to some cooperative elements of security in Europe, but obviously this would first imply fundamental changes in the behavior of the Russian Federation. I think they would first have to show in deeds and not only in words that they're again, willing to start playing along the rules. And then I would also agree, that we then, should be ready to reach out and say, okay, then let's also be ready to talk about some of the rules. I think we don't need to invent fundamentally the principles of European security, but we need again to come to a common understanding of what they really imply. And this would also imply that we are ready to address the dilemmas that some of the principles do raise. I mean, objectively speaking, do raise, and I think we have for too long not been willing to really tackle these dilemmas. But again, this is a long way from here. It takes two to tango, my friend. And for the time being, I don't see, the other side willing to tango. But I do hope that at some point this will happen again. And at least, the think tankers among us, we should start today thinking about how such a world could look like.
Thank you. Did you want to add on to that, Professor Ischinger? Did you want to add to that?
Well, maybe one aspect. Again, I have nothing to add to your description of what we can or what we should or what we cannot expect in the short term in terms of changes in Russian behavior. But there's the other side of the coin, which is the question of what exactly should our policy be? What exactly should our defined goal, our objective be? And I want to just, since most of you are not German nationals, I want to just recall one particularly important point on this from a German perspective. You see, on the 3rd of October of 1990, which was the day of German unification, the head of state of Germany at the time, as of that day, the head of United Germany, gentleman by the name of Richard von Weizsäcker, spoke at the Brandenburg Gate, his inaugural speech as on Unification Day as the president of United Germany. And in this rather long speech, he made the following point, which I think is worth remembering and actually worth keeping in mind. He said, it is, of course, a wonderful experience to see that the wall, which has been dividing Berlin, which has been dividing Germany, and which has been dividing Europe, is now gone. And what does this mean? And he added, it is now going to be our mission, speaking about Germany, to make sure that such a wall will not go up 1,000 kilometers to the east. It was then the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, still existed in 1990. And I think from a German perspective, this vision is not, should not be seen as wrong today only because Mr. Putin is doing everything he can to make it impossible for us to pursue this mission at the moment. In the long term, my view is that this mission remains a valid one, and we should doggedly pursue it. And each time I get a chance to talk to my Russian friends or interlocutors and vice foreign ministers or Sergei Lavrov occasionally, I always remind him of the Weizsäcker speech and say, this is actually what we would like to make sure, that there is no wall. But if you guys build it yourself by your own action, that's your responsibility. So I think we should retain, even at a moment when it looks terribly impossible to work in this direction, we should retain it as our ultimate mission, as our long-term vision of how we want to see a future European security architecture emerging.
Thank you so much. And I was just sharing with Professor, I lived through German unification in Washington, D.C. I was working at that time for the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies of the Johns Hopkins University. And I remember, well, we used to have seminars. A lot of people were worried whether Germany would stay in or out of NATO. And happily, Chancellor Helmut Kohl came up with the 10-point plan, which quickly soulaged everyone that they were definitely in. But thank you so much for that. I would like to now turn to the EU. We've covered NATO. There's a frequent discussion of the EU's aspirations with respect to strategic sovereignty or autonomy. How do you interpret this aspiration, and do you think it will lead to a more prominent European diplomacy? Perhaps you could start, Professor Ischinger.
Well, I have to confess, I've not been an ardent defender of this notion of strategic autonomy. I understand what is meant, and I share the ambition that is behind it, but I have had my own doubts about the usefulness of this particular concept at this particular moment in time, when it is quite evident that Europe as a strategic actor, that the EU as a geopolitical actor would be totally helpless in the current predicament without the strong leadership which the United States has fortunately once again been able to provide and continues to provide through the Biden administration. So I think if we interpret this concept of strategic autonomy in the right manner, we can explain it to our American friends in a way that would avoid a kind of alienation and raised eyebrows on the American side. And I think the right way of explaining it is by saying to our American friends, look, what we understand we in the European Union is that we cannot, in the year 2022 plus the future, consider ourselves, free riders, basing our own security on contributions by the Idaho farmer who pays his taxes, and that part of his taxes are used to protect these rich Europeans. That is not a good recipe for the future. And therefore, we Europeans need to get our act together and come up with a more credible contribution, both in terms of military substance, but also in terms of political decision-making capacity, in order to be a better partner for the US. And that leads me, if I may, to add one additional, I think, rather important point. For most European countries, in particular for Germany, which Germany used to be, of course, in the Cold War, the frontline state, with 300,000 Soviet soldiers on the other side of the German fence in the former GDR, and nuclear weapons looking at each other on both sides. From a German point of view, it is extremely important that the American solidarity with and the American willingness to continue to provide the quote-unquote nuclear umbrella remains unharmed. And we should carefully make sure that no misunderstandings are created in this respect. We should begin to understand that it is no longer guaranteed, after what we experienced with the Trump administration, is no longer permanently guaranteed that every successive American administration will consider NATO and the protection of Western Europe as one of its principal foreign policy aims. This is not written in the Bible, certainly not in the American Bible. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves for the first time in 70 years, a very simple question, which we did not need to ask ourselves before. And this very simple question is the following. Is there something that we should or could do, or is there something else that we should or could not do, that we could avoid doing, which would make it more likely for the American taxpayer to believe that Europe is actually a great asset to the United States? In other words, we need to develop a kind of a lobbying effort to make the American public believe again in the value, in the intrinsic value of America being a strongly engaged supporter of the European project and of the freedom and independence of Europe. So that is a question that, at least in my country, no one needed to ask between Presidents Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton, and Obama, because they were all pro-NATO. They were all essentially pro-Europe. But we do not know at this moment whether in 2024 or later, a new president might emerge in the United States who could have the same kinds of isolationist tendencies that we saw all of a sudden emerge during the Trump years. So I think that we need to make sure that our talk about strategic autonomy is not going to be interpreted in Washington as an attempt of Europe to cut itself loose from the United States. Our attempt should be the exact opposite. If we can interpret strategic autonomy as an effort to be a more valid, a more capable, meaningful, a better partner for the United States and for the American taxpayer, then we're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Greminger, one last question from me. In The Art of Diplomacy, Catherine Ashton highlighted that democracy remains our best method of giving power and control to the people. Every nation is an unfinished project on its democratic journey. However, Switzerland has always managed to remain a bastion of peace in a sea of discord. What do you think is the secret to its success? Is its diplomats and its art of diplomacy?
Well, let me first two points. First, I'm very much with Katie Ashton in the sense that we cannot take democracy for granted, clearly. And just if you look at global trends, figures, this is the trends are negative. Over the last 10 years, we are losing countries. I think it's fair to say that more than half of the world's population lives in non-democratic environments. So, and we have seen, even in liberal democracies, we've seen over the last decade strong authoritarian tendencies that are worrisome. So the first message would be, I think democracy requires political attention, citizens' engagement. This is democracy is a constant struggle. So there. Now the Swiss side of it. Yeah, well, I think in a way, I don't know if there is a secret, but I think our history has taught us to stay out of European power rivalry, right? And from the very beginning, basically, Switzerland started out as a very loose confederation of states, and it was clear, that this confederation would only survive if the states would kind of remain, well, today we call it neutral, non-aligned. Perhaps would legally be the better term for many centuries of Swiss history. So this kind of Switzerland becoming neutral by nature, by its history. I think that's perhaps one aspect that I would like to one point. The other point is, the way Switzerland is set up as a nation, I think has brought this deep sense of diversity and compromise, and because this is the only way how you can survive. If you have four distinct linguistic groups and somehow maintain a cohesion, keep them together, and this, I think, this sense somehow we have this compromise gene built in, and that perhaps also helps. It's interesting. I mean, Swiss politics have become, relatively speaking, much more confrontational in recent years. But still, I mean, it's not to be compared with Germany, for instance. And I think this has probably to do with these features that are, I think, quite linked up with our history. But I mean, let me just add a more self-critical point. I mean, I wouldn't, portray this image of self-righteousness and we have everything under control, all is fine. I mean, I just had a discussion with Wolfgang Ischinger before, and I said, when it comes to European integration, we are in deep trouble. We are in an impasse for years, and there is no way of finding out of this impasse. And and so I think we should also be at times. It would be good to be a bit more self-critical, and that would perhaps also help us to find our position in Europe.
Thank you so much. In The Art of Diplomacy, a strong thread throughout the book spoke about the power of emotion, the importance of personal and trusted connections, the human touch, and drinking exorbitant amounts of tea together.
Tea, not vodka.
What is the secret? What is the secret, according to you, Professor Ischinger, in building long and trusting relationships in your long and illustrious career as a diplomat, not only for Germany, but for the world?
Great question. First, let me mention an underestimated tool of diplomacy, or an underestimated element of diplomacy. That is the ability to listen. Most of my colleagues in the field of diplomacy believe that their most important ability is to speak, to be impressive speakers, as you and I are trying to demonstrate this morning. As a matter of fact, in the actual conduct of diplomacy, listening, in my experience, is not only at least as important as speaking, it is very often much more important. Because you can only conduct meaningful and successful negotiations if you understand your opponent's interests better than he does. If you can see what drives him and how he's being pushed by his own, instruction givers, then maybe you can find the trick to get this guy to agree a compromise. So listening is very, very important as an ability, and it requires a little bit of discipline to force yourself to listen rather than to start talking and talking. And I would add one final point, and the word has already been mentioned, namely the concept of trust. I don't know how many hundreds of times I've said in recent years that, at least in my own experience, trust is the currency of diplomacy. If there is trust, individuals, heads of state, ambassadorial delegations, diplomatic establishments can get a lot done. In the absence of trust, and our current impasse with Russia is a great example. How can you agree anything with the current Russian leadership if you have to believe that whatever they sign on to is not really meant seriously? So in the absence of trust, very little effective diplomacy is going to happen. In other words, one of the most important tasks of diplomacy is to try to build trust. And the problem of building trust is a problem that everybody who has a personal relationship with a partner or a marriage will understand by instinct. Destroying trust can literally happen overnight. It just needs one wrong step, and you will have lost the trust of your partner. Rebuilding that may take not only days or weeks, it may take months or years. And quite frankly, in the area of diplomacy, it's not much different. Building trust is a long-term project, and I'd like to end on a note of sadness, if I may say so. I feel very strongly as a German diplomat that the way my own government has behaved, at least how it has publicly presented itself over the last several months in the Ukraine crisis, has actually unfortunately led to a serious loss of trust by some, not by everybody, but certainly by our Eastern European partners. When I look at what I read from Polish and Baltic and other, even from Ukrainian sources, when I read what they write on Twitter or on Facebook or elsewhere in social media, I'm really saddened, but because I believe that the work of 2 or 3 decades of trust building, which we had committed ourselves to, given the devastations of World War II, for which no country is more responsible than my own, that we have now, unfortunately, lost quite a bit of the trust that had been built up. I hope this is not permanent. I hope this can be repaired. It would be a wonderful surprise for me if by tonight, when Olaf Scholz and Macron are on their way home, it would be a wonderful surprise for me if the media, not only in Kiev, but in the Baltic states, in Poland and elsewhere, would say, wow, we were wrong. These guys are tough supporters of the fight for territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. That would be a wonderful, pleasant surprise for me. I hope this is going to happen, but I'm afraid that speaking about trust as an important element of diplomacy, we have actually lost quite a bit of it by what I consider simply not very smart diplomacy, public diplomacy, over the last 3 months, essentially.